Okay, first I wanted to answer the question about Target. Why did they get hacked? It was a lack of investment in information in IT security. And you see that after every breach, you see that their budgets go tenfold up because they have to fix everything. So my name is Michael Mendelson. I'm an advisor in the IT security team. And I'm going to talk about what technologies we use to secure the cloud. So people talk about the cloud and is it secure, is it not secure? This is nothing new for somebody in IT security. I mean, I remember when wireless networks started. Everybody was terrified of wireless network. Oh my God, how can we have wireless in the building? Anybody outside can jump on. You know, same thing with mobile devices. We figure out ways to secure them. In fact, today, wireless networks are probably more secure than a wired network. So, you know, I'm on board with Bonnie. No doubt the cloud can be more secure than something on premises. It's really just increasing our threat landscape and what we need to make sure we secure. So we've heard cloud security comes with it several different models, right? There's the SaaS, there's PaaS, there's software as a service, platform as a service, infrastructure as a service. These different models all come with different shared responsibilities. I'm actually going to kind of pick up a little bit from the Amazon security person that was here earlier when he talked about shared responsibilities. He had a slide that showed the customer does this, we do this. Each of these have their own separate shared responsibility. And with these shared responsibilities, there's a different strategy that we're going to apply to secure it. So this is the slide that Bonnie was talking about that she likes. So really, from a securing the data perspective, our scope of responsibility is everything, right? We want to make sure that every one of these items is addressed. It's a matter of who's addressing it, right? So, for example, with SaaS, right, we're responsible for user access controls. We're responsible for application layer, level security. What I mean by that is, anytime you get a product, you're going to log in or you're going to, launch the application and you're going to see settings, right? You go into settings, you can turn on SSL, you can turn on, encryption, you can turn on, lockout policies, timeout policies, all those things. Those are our responsibilities. It's the vendor's responsibility for the other half in that example. When you jump to PaaS, well, we now have these four things that we're responsible for, right? We now have to worry about potentially middleware security, such as Apache, maybe a database, anywhere in the middle from the application down. Maybe platform-specific controls. Platform is a tricky one. So platform, you hear it all over the place. What does it really mean? It could mean an operating system up. It could mean a web layer up. It could mean even probably a database up. I actually have seen it sometimes where it's a storage. I know Amazon called S3 as infrastructure as a service. I've seen that maybe even considered as a platform, a storage platform. And then the biggest one, infrastructure as a security, where you have your network layer controls now. You now have your system controls. You basically are given an environment that can be virtualized into anything you want. So you have to be responsible for everything. The one thing that's always in the cloud that the vendor is going to have is going to be the physical security. So with the responsibility half that falls on the vendor, that's where we're going to lean on contracts. Actually, that's my next slide. We're going to lean on the ESM process. So what Kelly was talking about, we're going to make sure that the right questions are asked of these vendors. We're going to make sure they have the right controls within their SOC 2. Legal contracts. I'd say lately, the last few months, I work with Bonnie. Almost every day I talk to Bonnie, and Kelly as well. What's that?
Great.
It is. It's a lot of fun. But we're basically making sure that the vendor is doing that other half. And if they're not, there's either an exception or some kind of risk exception needs to place, or we can maybe mitigate it with some other controls that we can leverage. And then there's this new statement that's going around that identity is the new perimeter. I think especially with SaaS, I bolded it. That's absolutely true. So when we're on premises, the perimeter has always been firewalls. Now in the cloud and with SaaS especially, right? The identity is a perimeter because all of that other stuff, the firewalls, all the controls that they're doing to protect the infrastructure, that's all going to be in the contract. That's all going to be in that ESM review when we match up our controls with their controls, and we want to make sure that it's covered. That's going to be their side. So from our perspective, identity is that new perimeter. And the great news is CA products are very strong in this space, especially the SaaS space. So, what products do we have in place to secure the cloud? So, we have SiteMinder. Passwords, we don't store passwords on any of our cloud applications. So, for example, Salesforce, which is a SaaS app, it uses single sign-on. It uses SiteMinder. What we store up there is there's no passwords. There's a trust back with SiteMinder, and the authentication is done through SiteMinder, and there's that trust between SiteMinder and Salesforce, and it logs you in. So if somebody were to hack Salesforce, they're not getting our corporate passwords. They might get our corporate IDs. They might find out who has access to what and what permissions they have, but they're not getting any passwords. And since it is our domain credentials, essentially, that's a good thing because now they can't log into our VPN or potentially hack our email or whatever. So another great product we have is Identity Minder. Right? Identity Minder is used to provision and deprovision access to that cloud. So, for example, somebody gets hired, the HR puts them into the HR system in SAP, a nightly job gets processed with Identity Minder, and that access is provisioned across the board, across our apps. The same thing with deprovisioning. So, same thing with deprovisioning. And another product we have that's actually great, we want to leverage more of, it's actually something that just went live recently, is Governance Minder. Governance Minder is a relatively recent acquisition of CA. It's very similar to SAP's GRC product. What it does is it actually consumes all the user IDs from an application and what access they have, and you can then create workflow around that. So you can do user access reviews. So if there's a specific role or permission that somebody has access to, that role or permission, whoever's the owner of it, can get an email saying, hey, this person, you probably all see this actually all the time because we just started doing it. This person has access to these permissions in this SaaS app, right? Are they still allowed to have these permissions? And if you click no, something that we want to hook up is Governance Minder would then talk to Identity Minder and actually deprovision those permissions. Another neat thing that you can do with Governance Minder is actually create shopping carts for permissions. So end users can go in self-service and say, hey, with Salesforce, I now need to do this and this and this. And they make kind of like a shopping cart of what they want to do in that SaaS application. And it sends it to whoever owns that access for approval. They grant the approval. And through automation with Identity Minder, it's going to give you those permissions. So it's a great product. So between these three products, we pretty much have SaaS pretty well secured as long as they're doing what they say they're doing in the contracts review in the contracts and the ESM process. Any questions with that last slide? No. So here's a checklist. The end in mind for SaaS.
I'm sorry, Mike. I have a question.
Yes, Mark.
How do we ensure? I mean, and maybe this is happening. Maybe it's transparent to us that these tools are being used. But how do we make sure that they're being used, or?
So that's a good question because in a lot of cases we're playing catch up. It can be ensured by doing, meetings like this, summits like this, where we explain it to everybody, and then hopefully, like Chris, when he has a project, can come to us and say, hey, we're doing this new SaaS project. Let's get you guys on board. We want to get in the queue to get Identity Minder, involved. So that we don't have to have nightly batch processes or whatever coming out of SAP and doing some hokey pokey script that's going to get people access. Yeah.
So just to extend Mike's point, so all projects like the ones that I would implement are governed by GIS's SDLC. These steps are part of that process. So many of these steps right now are compulsory for in-scope SOX applications. So I'm putting at the moment a treasury system in, it's in the cloud. Governance Minder is an absolute requirement. I can't go live without it. So those are the types of things that we have in place to ensure, at least for the most high-risk data and high-risk processes, we've got that in place and it's getting extended down. And we're also sort of catching up with stuff that we've not done in the past because the products didn't exist.
Yeah, so that's a good point. That's absolutely true. In addition, it actually benefits, sorry, Tom, just give me a sec. It actually benefits the business because we have a lot of applications today that are not integrated with Governance Minder, for example, that are highly confidential apps, through Bonnie's data classification policy. And part of the IT controls associated with that data classifications will say, hey, you have to do quarterly reviews of access of this application. If they're not in Governance Minder, they got themselves a huge manual process that they have to do, or they have to somehow convince our operations team in India to do. And it's not a fun process. It involves spreadsheets and manually going in and copying and pasting like crazy. And if they just worked with us early on, or we get integrated into Governance Minder, that'll all become automated because Governance Minder handles that workflow right out of the box.
So could I just real briefly? I want to kill a bird with a stone here. We were talking earlier about the Cloud Summit. Well, this is perfect. I don't want anybody to forget this conversation in 20 minutes when we were going to introduce this again. But to Mark's point, and one of the purposes of this summit, I think, is to let the stakeholders and ultimately the rest of the company know what CA's cloud strategy is, and a large focus on our internal cloud strategy. And one of the things that we were concerned about, we were talking about earlier, is that the people that come here and listen to this today, that saw the vendors present, that might be looking on media site, independent of knowing what our overall process is, might be under the impression that things like SaaS in particular are easy to just go and get kind of on their own. And one thing that and Phil and I were going to reiterate in a couple of minutes, but this is a perfect lead into that, is that these are the kinds of things that need to be considered. And it's important that everybody understands that the cloud doesn't alleviate GIS's involvement in your partnership with your business solutions. These types of things, integration with Identity Minder, scrutiny on the IT security, and other things that I may talk about in 15 or 20 minutes, are the kinds of things you'll be missing if we don't come together and do this as a partnership. And it's not going to be GIS's cloud strategy that we talk about in 20 minutes. This is really the cloud strategy for the business.
Yeah. Yeah, so good point, Tom. And a lot of these, I'm not covering a lot of the stuff that Bonnie covered because we kind of collaborated beforehand. But the other huge section of this with all the controls and all, the strategy is already there. I work with Bonnie. When that list she had up before, we worked on every single one of those together. Reviewed the controls, got SSA 16 SOC 2s. Melanie's involved with that review as well. And we make sure all those controls are in place and identified during the project implementation. So here's a checklist for SaaS. SaaS applications, they must follow the guidelines for data classification and the IT controls. Encryption in transit is a play here with SaaS. The reason why I don't have encryption in REST here is you'll see that later on in infrastructure as a service. Encryption in REST would show up on the responsibility of the vendor for SaaS, right? So we would make sure that is in the contract or in there. I don't know if anybody's ever seen an SSA 16. It's a lot of fun to read. I might just because I'm a security guy, but I read them and I sometimes get ideas for things that we should be doing here. And I go, wow, this is just a fantastic, very technical. They talk about everything, encryption and REST and things like that. Cloud implementations should be integrated into the SIM. So when we're dealing with a cloud product, okay, we don't have the same insight that we have with an on-premise solution. Okay, we don't see I'm going to use a term that I sometimes hate when people use, the bits and bytes going back and forth. We can't look at, firewall logs or see how the traffic's flowing, or even like an IPS where you can actually sniff the traffic on the wire. So logging is our most important control. So whatever the application, whatever that SaaS application gives us, we need to integrate into a SIM. And I should tell you what a SIM is. So a SIM is a security information and event management system. Essentially, it's a big data solution for security. It consumes logs from all over the place and presents it in a format that you can then create actionable events on and do operational workflow from. So So we need as much data as we can into that SIM from whatever the application is. And it gets more and more intense as we go along because this is just the application layer. So I mentioned automated deprovisioning and provisioning of accounts with IdentityMinder. We don't want that to be manual. We don't want that to be a nightly batch process even. We want it to be almost near real time because a lot of times when there's terminations or somebody's leaving the company, EU aside, that was actually one of my questions for Sharon. EU aside, but when somebody gets terminated, we want to get rid of their access right away. What was the next one? Oh, end users with the ability to request access and roles with Governance Minder, and we want to use IdentityMinder self-service portals so that they can request access themselves and so that managers can go ahead and remove access from users without involving any service desk tickets or asking anybody to do it for them, all self-service. Login and access is required to be integrated with SiteMinder. We're pretty good here. SiteMinder has a nice benefit to it in that it's a security control and it prevents the passwords from being in the application, but it also is a very big convenient factor. Nobody wants to have to log into every application they go to. So because of that convenience, people usually come to us and say, we need SiteMinder, we need single sign-on. So we're pretty good with SiteMinder. I think, if you listen to some of our executive management team, they want it in more places, but I think we're pretty good with SiteMinder rollouts. All the native security settings that are with the application, I just mentioned SSL, timeouts, lockouts, if somebody's on an application for 2 hours, automatically sign them out. All these things are in QMS and different policies for best practices. So whatever settings are available within the application, we're going to want to set. And if you don't know what it is, work with somebody on the security team to get those things set. And then last but not least, as we get different applications, such as Salesforce or even as we go down, this is probably going to repeat itself a few times, file share and all those things. We want to make sure that everybody's trained, particularly the security staff. We recently took a training course on Amazon to learn the nuts and bolts within Amazon and how we can secure that. Now our operations team is going through the same. Training is extremely important here. Any questions on that slide? So again, this is just a quick recap. Automated provisioning, deprovisioning, automation of user access reviews, role-based access controls. Here's something I didn't cover, separations of duties. This is a tricky one, and Governance Minder can help us here. So with our SAP implementation, we're pretty good here because it's one system, it's one big monolithic system, and it comes with its own, well, there's an add-on that we purchased for SAP that does SOD rule checking. But essentially, if somebody has permissions to buy something, say I want to buy a new laptop, and I can also go in and approve that order, that's a problem, right? You want the guy's manager to approve it. That's a very simple example. There's examples that it takes a few hours to even understand how it's a separation of duties issue, but they get pretty complicated. As we move to the cloud, it gets even more complicated because we're going to have probably a lot of point solutions and different applications doing different things. So, for example, somebody logs into, I'll say Salesforce might be a bad example. Somebody logs into, JP Morgan Zine and does some, submits some purchase order or some PO or whatever, and then they can log into SAP the next day when it copies over and hit approve. That's the same SOD, but now it's cross-system. So how do we handle that? Governance Minder actually has the ability of also creating SOD rule sets. Single sign-on with SiteMinder, setting those configurations, integrating with SIM. I also had DLP in there, data loss prevention. Some applications come with their own native DLP. We may want to look into turning that on a per application basis. So that's another thing to consider for SaaS. And here's a basic. This is a very generic reference architecture, just kind of showing you, how things communicate to each other. So if you're on premises here in the building, you're going to go through Zscaler to that SaaS application. SaaS application is going to talk back to SiteMinder, which is going to be also in the cloud soon in AWS. All these things are being pointed back, directed to the SIM for log management and collection, and you have IdentityMinder and Governance Minder. And then there's a security operations analyst that's going to review those SIM logs and those events. You're going to see as we go along how drastically this changes and the complexity increases. So by far, from a security perspective, we prefer a SaaS application first, right? If you can go to SaaS before building everything in an infrastructure as a service model, I much more prefer it, right? As long as their SSA 16 and all their legal contracts cover everything else. So PaaS,
Hey, Mike.
yes.
Can I just interrupt you with a suggestion? So past few, and I wanted to get your idea or understanding on this. Past few slides that you went through and then the last one, in my mind, you probably want to collect, and I'll come and get that from you, these together as a pattern for,
Yeah.
SaaS cloud implementation.
These should definitely turn into
pattern.
architectural patterns.
That becomes part of our cloud reference architecture that Phil and Tom are creating, right? And exactly. So here we have a reference architecture for cloud. Part of that is SaaS pattern, so that every project that comes in, to answer Chris's question, right, they have an architectural pattern that they can refer to rather than having to know all these things, which you are expert at. So I'll come hound you for the
Yeah.
patterns.
We'll do that. Okay. What was that? All right. So PaaS. From a security perspective, I think we need to have it well defined. What exactly is meant by the platform if somebody's rolling out a PaaS solution, so that we can figure out that line of what we're responsible for, what we're not responsible for. So the next 2 slides, some of those items may or may not be there as much. It's not as clear defined as something that's going to be a SaaS or a IaaS. We may need to do, let me see if I'm probably going to jump ahead. Well, let me go to the next one. So PaaS builds on all the security technologies of SaaS, right? So anything that I mentioned before is also going to take a play. All the time with PaaS and with IaaS, there's going to be a SaaS component, right? There's going to be some kind of portal that you need to log into to manage your access or your settings and all that. There's going to be that application that it comes with. That application is going to need to be secured as well with single sign-on and with identity manager and all those things. So with PaaS, we might now have remote access. We might need to secure remote access with APIs. Maybe even there might be an SSH or some kind of RDP, remote access into that platform. Those things are going to need to be secured. There may be VPN connectivity directly into the platform. And now vulnerability management might need to be done. If we're consuming, like a web tier, say for example, we're consuming Apache. All we're getting is the Apache layer. They're managing the operating system. We might need to patch that Apache. I'm not sure. They might do it. We might need to do it. There's a gray line there. So we need to, going back to the first point, we need to well define what our responsibilities are for PaaS. So again, you got the remote access. You got your API, VPN, B2B connectivity, patch management. Vulnerability management might now be involved as well. And any additional opportunities to collect logs should be looked at. So we see it gets a little bit more complex, especially with the lines. We now see that I've added IT Client Manager, or maybe they changed the name of it. CA's always changed the name of that product. But that's essentially a product that handles patch management and pushing packages and software delivery to the platform if it's an OS. And we also now see platform administrators added. We see our vulnerability management solution, which, by the way, is also a cloud solution that we use. And so it's adding a little bit more complexity, and you see the data center kind of grew a little bit more. It's getting closer to that platform. And then we have IaaS. So IaaS builds on everything that we just talked about with SaaS and PaaS. All those items need to be there. We now are going to need to consider encryption at rest. Okay. The vendor that we use, for example, Amazon, they have certain encryption type solutions for their storage. If we can leverage it, let's leverage it. If it doesn't work, we might need to bring our own encryption to the cloud, depending on the data classification, of course. Direct connectivity between the cloud and our on-premises. So, for example, and Tom and Phil are going to get into this, I'm sure. I'll just do it briefly. We now have a middle site. So we go from our data center to Equinix, Equinix through an MPLS circuit, and then to that direct connect that Amazon talked about into our virtual private cloud. So that gives us a great vantage point for security solutions. That Equinix site is almost like a choke point between all of our offices and that cloud. So we can deploy things now like IPS, which is intrusion prevention, which if for you guys don't know what that is, it's a technology that actually inspects the packets as they go across the network, and you can apply rules to say, hey, well, this traffic might be malicious, and we then back to the SIM and collect that data. Application deployment teams. Using YAS, we want to make sure that everything's already pre-built for them. Okay, so we built a lot of security groups within Amazon. Security groups are another firewall concept, so that when people need to build stuff, as we get more and more mature, it'll be there for them, right? So we want to use solutions that the cloud vendor provides us first. Okay, there's lots of companies out there, I'm sure, that when they get a YAS product, they're putting their virtual Cisco firewalls and all their virtual VPNs and all this other stuff in there, and that just adds more stuff to manage. It actually, from my perspective, defeats the purpose of using cloud, right? Because you're now bringing all your on-premise stuff virtually to the cloud. It destroys the flexibility and the speed of what you want to do. If you're using Amazon's native network ACL policies and their native security groups and their native IAM tools and all this other stuff, as they upgrade stuff, you just benefit from it, right? They're doing it all for you. That actually kind of shifts that responsibility line a little bit more in their direction, which we want to do, right? We want to get the most for our money. So we want to use the things that they give us, and that's our strategy. I mentioned something here about DevOps. Nobody's mentioned it yet. From a security perspective, I think automation is key, okay? For those of you probably heard our CEO mention DevOps a few times. DevOps is really all about automation and allowing end users to use the cloud without having to involve everybody else, and just they go ahead and they use they get things pre-built and they click on something and automation kicks off and gets them what they need a lot faster, a lot more quicker. So by doing that, from a security perspective, we can now bake our security tools into that automation process. All of our settings and things that we want in there can be baked into that automation. And then when they're provisioning stuff, it just does it for us in a consistent way. And we know that every system has this because it was built this way, right? When people are point building things, one-offs in the cloud, yeah, it's still great. You're still moving faster. You can provision a system in an hour and all that other stuff. But are the settings consistent? We're not sure. But if there's automation in play, we know it is, right? So again, we have encryption at rest. We might now have direct network connections between the two, between our on-premise sites and the cloud sites. Firewalls are now in play because of that site, as well as the stuff Amazon provides us with ACLs. The security groups that I mentioned, intrusion prevention now can be utilized. We now have to worry about endpoint malware. So we have to worry about our, the age-old antivirus software that goes on the systems. We need to think about that because we're managing those systems. And SIM, we want to get more SIM, more SIM. That you're going to hear me say every time. For example, this morning, Amazon mentioned that they just announced CloudTrail, which is for us was like everybody in my area, over there was all buzzing with joy. You can now get audit events from Amazon, which is huge. If somebody changes something on Amazon, if somebody goes ahead and provisions a system that we don't know about, or deprovisions a system, or changes access, or does anything in Amazon, even logs in, we get an audit event that gets created by that CloudTrail service. And our SIM can then consume that CloudTrail and incorporate it into the rest of our rules. And we can do, cross-system if somebody logged in here and did this and did that. And you can do all kinds of, great rules there with the SIM. So we want to make sure that we're getting the logs everywhere. And so now we have a YAS, again, a very generic reference architecture. And we now see an IPS sitting in that Equinix choke point. This is it's somewhat AWS-centric. But I just use that as an example because it's something that you're going to probably hear when Tom and Phil talk, and I think anyway, I'm not sure. But you have now an IPS. We now see firewalls in place here that we can control. That little lockup target is supposed to be security groups. You now have platform administrators that need to be managing that as well, security analysts managing the SIM. We now have McAfee AV products in there. VPN connections. I mean, this is now essentially, and the data center is starting to, it's really in there. It's touching the cloud. So that's kind of generic. I don't want to get too, I don't want to confuse people too much. But as we go on, some of these things might actually move into the cloud, as we push more stuff into the cloud. It might make sense. For example, I've been talking about getting vulnerability management, whatever that scanner is that's scanning those items. Why not just put that in the cloud? Why are we going across, our connections and such to do those scanning? Why does SIM have to collect through the pipe? Maybe SIM should be in there collecting as well. So there's different architecture changes that are going to take place, as we get more and more stuff into the cloud that makes sense. But this is just as kind of how it is today. And I wanted to give you guys an idea of all the different security technologies at play. So I went into this already. I know I'm probably out of time. You gave me the signal. Again, I just mentioned DevOps and automation and how we want to be baked into that automation to help ensure consistent security settings. And these are some of the courses and whatnot, training that we want our team to take place. For example, many of us have already taken this course. There's a great consortium out there, I guess you'd call them, a Cloud Security Alliance, they're called, CSA. Lots of great data there. They actually have a certificate called the CCSK, which is a generic cloud security certification. I'm hoping to get some of our team to take that class. Some of the operations courses with AWS. And then OpenStack, Rackspace actually has a security certification for OpenStack to better understand the nature of that open source platform and how to best secure it. Thank you.